The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty street of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, 1885, as Grace Abernathy found herself in a predicament that had started with nothing more than a laugh. It wasn't just any laugh. It was a hearty, unrestrained burst of amusement that had escaped her lips when Vernon Tully, the wealthiest man in the county, had fallen face first into a water trough after boasting about his superior horseback riding skills. What she hadn't known was that laughing at Vernon Tully in public was something no one dared to do, especially not a woman with no family or fortune to protect her. Grace stood in the center of town, her chestnut hair falling from its pins as the auctioneer's voice rang out. $20 for the girl. Do I hear 25? She's healthy, can cook and clean, and would make a fine wife or housekeeper. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just yesterday she'd been working as a seamstress at Mrs. Potter's shop, and today she was being sold like cattle to pay off damages to Mr. Tully's reputation. The territorial judge, a drinking companion of Tully's, had ruled that her public mockery constituted slander, and with no money to pay the outrageous fine, she was to be sold into servitude for 6 months. $30, called a voice from the crowd, belonging to a weathered rancher with yellowed teeth, who was eyeing her in a way that made her skin crawl. 40, countered another man, equally unpleasant. Grace swallowed hard, fighting back tears of rage and fear. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she lifted her chin defiantly, even as her heart hammered in her chest. $100, came a deep, steady voice from the back of the gathering. The crowd parted to reveal a tall figure in a worn leather duster. He wore a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, but Grace could make out a strong jawline covered in stubble. He moved forward with the easy, confident gait of a man accustomed to the saddle. "Well now," the auctioneer said with surprise, "we have $100 from Mr. Yale Vance." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Grace had heard of Yale Vance most everyone in 3 counties had. He owned the Half Moon Ranch outside of town, and was known to be as skilled with a gun as he was with horses. Some said he'd ridden with the Rangers in Texas before settling in Arizona. Others claimed he'd been a bounty hunter. No one seemed to know for certain, but all agreed he was not a man to be trifled with. As Yale Vance approached the auction block, Grace noticed his eyes a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. He looked her up and down, not in the leering way of the other bidders, but with a calculating gaze that seemed to see right through her. "Anyone else care to bid against Mr. Vance?" the auctioneer called, his voice less confident now. The crowd remained silent. Even Vernon Tully, standing at the front with a smug expression, didn't dare to counter the bid. "Sold, then, to Mr. Vance for $100. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. From one nightmare to another. What did this man want with her? What would become of her now? As the auctioneer hurried over with papers for Yale to sign, the cowboy glanced at her again. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he noted her defiant stance. "Laugh all you want now, Darlin," he drawled quietly, just for her ears. "You'll have plenty of reasons to once we're clear of this town." Grace's eyes widened. Was he mocking her? Threatening her? She couldn't tell, but something in his tone lacked the malice she'd expected. With the transaction completed, Yale Vance took the rope that had been tied around Grace's wrists. The symbolic gesture of ownership made her stomach turn. "My horse is this way," he said, leading her through the dispersing crowd. Vernon Tully stepped into their path, his round face flushed with whiskey and triumph. "Teach her some manners, Vance. That one's got a disrespectful mouth on her." Yale stopped, his expression unchanged, but something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "I reckon you know all about disrespect, don't you, Tully?" he said mildly. "Selling a woman for laughing at your sorry behind." Tully's face darkened. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Yale cut him off, his voice dropping to a tone that made even Grace shiver. "The lady's paid her debt. According to the law, you're so fond of twisting. Any further trouble comes her way. I'll know exactly who to hold accountable." Without waiting for a response, Yale guided Grace around the sputtering man and continued toward a magnificent Palomino horse tied to a hitching post. "Can you ride?" he asked, untying the rope from her wrists. Grace rubbed at the raw skin. "Yes." "Good. We've got a ways to go before dark." He untied his horse and mounted in one fluid motion, then extended a hand down to her. Grace hesitated. staring at his outstretched palm. "I could just drag you behind if you prefer," he said, though the twinkle in his eye suggested he wasn't serious. With reluctance, she took his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but remained steady. "Hold on," Yale instructed, as he turned the horse toward the edge of town. Grace placed her hands tentatively on his sides, determined to maintain as much distance as possible. Yale chuckled. "You'll fall off that way. I don't bite, Miss Abernathy." Grudgingly, she moved closer and wrapped her arms around his waist, immediately noticing the solid muscle beneath his shirt. They rode in silence for nearly half an hour, leaving Silver Creek behind and heading into open country. The desert stretched out around them, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree, the mountains a purple smudge on the horizon. "Where are you taking me?" Grace finally asked, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer. "Half Moon Ranch," he replied. "About 2 hours' ride from here." "And what am I to do there?" she pressed, dreading the answer. Yale glanced over his shoulder. "Whatever you're good at, I suppose. Can you cook?" "Yes." "Good. Cook's been threatening to quit for a month now. Says the ranch hands are too picky." "So I'm to be your cook?" Grace asked, confusion evident in her voice. "If you want, or you can help with the housekeeping. We need someone to keep the books in order, too. My foreman tries, but numbers aren't his strong suit." Grace frowned. This wasn't what she had expected. "Mr. Vance, why did you buy me?" Yale was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody should be sold for laughing, Miss Abernathy, especially not at a fool like Vernon Tully." "That's very noble," she said, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "But you paid $100 for me. What do you really want?" He reined the horse to a stop and twisted in the saddle to look at her directly. His blue eyes were serious now, the playfulness gone. "What I want, Miss Abernathy, is to right a wrong. Once your 6 months are up, you're free to go wherever you please with my blessing and enough money to start fresh. Until then, I'm offering you honest work for honest pay." Grace studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" A shadow passed over his features. "Let's just say, I know what it's like to be at the mercy of men like Tully." Before she could question him further, he turned back around and urged the horse forward. They continued in silence, Grace's mind whirling with questions and cautious hope. The sun was beginning its descent when they crested a hill, revealing a sprawling ranch below. A large main house stood at the center, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and a bunkhouse off to the side. Cattle dotted the pastures that stretched toward distant mountains. "Welcome to Half Moon," Yale said as they approached. As they rode into the ranch yard, several men paused in their work to watch. A tall, lean man with graying hair stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "That was quick," he called. "Thought you'd be in town till tomorrow at least." Yale dismounted and helped Grace down. "Change of plans, Frank? This is Miss Grace Abernathy. She'll be staying with us for a while." Frank looked from Yale to Grace with raised eyebrows, but asked no questions. "Madam," he said with a nod. "Frank Hollis, foreman." Grace nodded back, unsure of her standing or what to say. "Miss Abernathy needs a place to stay," Yale continued. "Is the room off the kitchen ready?" "Should be," Frank replied. "Marta's been using it for storage, but there's a bed in there." "Good. Would you show her the way? I need to tend to Sundance here." Yale patted the Palomino's neck. "Sure thing, boss." Frank gestured for Grace to follow him toward the main house. "Mr. Hollis," Grace said as they walked, "what exactly does Mr. Vance expect of me?" Frank gave her a sidelong glance. "Don't rightly know, madam, but Yale's a fair man. If he says you're welcome here, then you are." The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, it was surprisingly well furnished, with polished wood floors covered by woven rugs, comfortable-looking furniture, and shelves lined with books. "Kitchen's through here," Frank said, leading her to a large, well-equipped room at the back of the house. A plump, middle-aged woman with dark hair streaked with gray was kneading dough at a large wooden table. She looked up as they entered, her hands covered in flour. "Who's this, then?" she asked, her accent revealing Spanish origins. "Marta, this is Miss Abernathy," Frank explained. "She'll be staying in the back room. Boss's orders. Marta looked Grace up and down with frank curiosity. "The room off the pantry? It's full of linens and preserves." "Yale says to clear it out," Frank replied with a shrug. Marta wiped her hands on her apron. "Very well. I could use some help around here anyway." She addressed Grace directly. "Can you cook, girl?" "Yes," Grace answered, squaring her shoulders. "I can cook, clean, sew, and keep accounts." Marta's eyebrows rose. "Education, have you?" "Good. The men eat at 6. That gives you an hour to settle in and help with dinner." With that, the woman returned to her dough, effectively dismissing them. Frank led Grace through the pantry to a small room beyond. It was indeed being used for storage, with shelves lining the walls and crates stacked in corners, but there was a narrow bed against one wall. "It's not much," Frank acknowledged, "but it's private. There's a washroom down the hall you can use." "Thank you," Grace said quietly. Frank paused at the door. "Miss Abernathy, I don't know what arrangement you have with Yale, and it's none of my business, but you should know he's a good man. Whatever brought you here, you're safe now." With that, he left her alone to contemplate her strange change in circumstances. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day washing over her in a wave of exhaustion and confusion. Just hours ago, she'd been standing on an auction block, her future bleak and terrifying. Now she was in a stranger's home, promised safety and fair treatment. It seemed too good to be true. And in Grace's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Yet there had been something in Yale Vance's eyes, a sincerity, or perhaps a shared understanding of injustice that made her want to believe him. She would work hard, she decided, prove her worth, and save every penny. And in 6 months, she would walk away free, beholden to no one, ready to build a new life far from Silver Creek and Vernon Tully's reach. But first, she had a dinner to help prepare and a household to understand. With a deep breath, Grace stood, straightened her rumpled dress, and went to find Marta in the kitchen. Whatever fate had in store for her at Half Moon Ranch, she would face it with the same courage that had gotten her through everything else life had thrown her way. As Grace stepped back into the kitchen, Marta glanced up from her dough. "There you are. Wash your hands and start chopping those vegetables. The men are hungry after a day's work." Grace did as instructed, finding comfort in the familiar routine of kitchen work. As they prepared the meal, a hearty beef stew with biscuits, she learned that Marta had worked for Yale Vance since he established the ranch 5 years ago. "He came here with nothing but his horse, his gun, and enough money to buy this land," Marta explained as she stirred the stew. "Built it up from nothing. Now, Half Moon's one of the most successful ranches in the territory." "He seems young to have accomplished so much," Grace observed, carefully slicing carrots. 32 this past spring, but he's lived more life than men twice his age." Marta gave her a pointed look. "How old are you, girl?" 23, Grace replied. "And my name is Grace, not girl." Marta's lips twitched. "Got spirit, I see. Good. You'll need it around here." She nodded toward the doorway. "Take those biscuits out of the oven. The men will be washing up soon." By the time dinner was ready, Grace had met most of the ranch hands, a diverse group of men who treated her with curious but respectful nods. They ate in a separate dining area attached to the bunkhouse, while Yale took his meals in the main house's dining room. "Take this to him," Marta said, handing Grace a loaded tray. "And mind you don't spill." Balancing the tray carefully, Grace made her way to the dining room, where Yale sat alone at a large table, papers spread before him. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said as she set the tray down. "Will you join me?" Grace hesitated. "Is that an order, Mr. Vance?" He set aside his papers. "No, it's an invitation, and please, call me Yale." After a moment's consideration, she nodded and took the seat across from him. Marta appeared with another plate, giving Grace a knowing look before retreating to the kitchen. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Yale spoke. "Have you settled in all right?" "Yes, thank you." Grace kept her eyes on her plate. "The room is comfortable." "Good." He took a sip of water. "I want to make something clear, Miss Abernathy. Your situation here is unusual, I know, but I meant what I said earlier. You're here to work, nothing more. You'll be paid fair wages that will be held for you until your 6 months are up." Grace finally looked up at him. "Why did you really buy my contract?" Mr. Vance. Yale set down his fork. I was in town to sell some horses when I saw the commotion. When I realized what was happening, he shook his head. I've seen injustice before. Sometimes I've been powerless to stop it. This time, I wasn't. That's very altruistic, Grace said carefully. A wry smile crossed his face. Not entirely. As you've probably noticed, we could use help around here. Marta does what she can, but she's getting on in years. The ranch is growing, and with it, the work. Grace studied him, trying to discern his true intentions. There was a guardedness about him, but also an openness that was disarming. Whatever his reasons, he had saved her from a fate that could have been much worse. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did. Whatever your reasons." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Tomorrow Frank will show you around the ranch. You should know your way around if you're going to be here for 6 months." After dinner, Grace helped Marta clean up, then retired to her small room. Someone, Marta, she presumed, had cleared enough space for her to move comfortably, and had left a nightgown and some basic toiletries on the bed. As she prepared for sleep, Grace reflected on the day's extraordinary events. She was still technically in servitude, but it seemed she had fallen into the hands of a decent man. Whether Yale Vance's apparent kindness would last remained to be seen. But for now, she was warm, fed, and safe, which was more than she could have hoped for that morning. The next few days established a routine. Grace rose early to help Marta with breakfast, then spent the mornings cleaning the main house or helping with laundry. In the afternoons, she often assisted with bookkeeping, organizing the ranch's accounts with an efficiency that clearly impressed Frank. Yale himself was frequently absent, riding out with the ranch hands to check on cattle, repair fences, or deal with the myriad tasks required to run a successful operation. When their paths crossed, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain distance that Grace found both puzzling and reassuring. A week after her arrival, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see Yale riding in, his expression grim. Behind him, 2 ranch hands supported a third man, whose leg was wrapped in a bloody makeshift bandage. "Marta!" Yale called as he dismounted. "Get the doctor's kit. Jim's been gored by a steer." Grace dropped the sheet she was hanging and rushed forward. "Bring him to the kitchen table," she directed. "It's sturdy enough." The men carried their injured companion into the house while Marta hurried to fetch medical supplies. Grace cleared the kitchen table and laid down clean cloths. "The doctor's in Tucson," Frank said, appearing in the doorway. "Won't be back until tomorrow at least." "Let me see," Grace said, stepping forward as they laid the moaning man on the table. She carefully unwrapped the blood-soaked bandage to reveal a deep gash in the man's thigh. "It needs cleaning and stitching." "You know how?" Yale asked, standing at her shoulder. Grace nodded. "I worked for a doctor's wife in Kansas before coming west. She taught me some nursing." She looked up at Marta, who had returned with the medical kit. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey both for cleaning and for him to drink." Within minutes, Grace was working efficiently, cleaning the wound as the man Jim bit down on a leather strap. Yale stood nearby, holding Jim's shoulders steady as Grace prepared to stitch the wound. "You're doing just fine, Jim," Yale reassured the man. "Miss Abernathy here's going to fix you up better than Doc Wilson ever could." Grace appreciated the vote of confidence, though she wasn't sure she deserved it. Still, her hands remained steady as she worked, methodically closing the wound with neat stitches while Marta and Frank assisted. When she finally finished, Jim had passed out from pain and whiskey, but his breathing was steady and the bleeding had stopped. Grace bandaged the wound and stepped back, suddenly aware of how blood spattered her dress had become. "Will he be all right?" Yale asked quietly. "If infection doesn't set in," Grace replied, washing her hands in a basin. "He should stay off that leg for at least 2 weeks." Yale nodded, studying her with new respect. "You're full of surprises, Miss Abernathy." Grace felt herself flush under his gaze. "I just did what needed doing." "That's a rare quality," he said. His eyes lingered on her face a moment longer before he turned to help Frank move Jim to a cot they'd set up in the corner of the kitchen. That night, after checking on Jim one last time, Grace found Yale sitting alone on the front porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. He looked up as she stepped outside. "Jim's sleeping," she reported. "No sign of fever yet." "Good," Yale said. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Join me?" Grace hesitated only briefly before sitting down. The night air was cool and fragrant with sage, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional hoot of an owl. "You're not what I expected, Grace Abernathy," Yale said after a comfortable silence. "What did you expect?" she asked. He smiled slightly. "I'm not sure. Not someone who could stitch up a man's leg without flinching. Not someone who could reorganize my accounts in 3 days when Frank's been struggling with them for months." "Life has a way of teaching you what you need to know," Grace replied, thinking of all she'd had to learn since her parents died 5 years ago. "That it does," Yale agreed. He turned to look at her directly. "I haven't asked about your circumstances. Before Silver Creek, I mean." "It's not my place to pry." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the mild evening. "There's not much to tell. My parents died of influenza in '80. I was 18. I've been making my own way since then, Kansas, Colorado, and finally Arizona. I was doing well enough as a seamstress in Silver Creek until you laughed at the wrong man," Yale finished for her. "Yes." Grace's lips curved in a small, defiant smile. "He did look ridiculous, you know. All his posturing and preening, and then, splash, face first in the horse trough." Yale chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet night. "I wish I'd seen it." "Well, it cost me dearly," Grace said, her smile fading. "If not for you, I'd likely be in a much worse situation now." "I doubt that," Yale said. "A woman with your resourcefulness would find a way to survive." "Perhaps, but thank you all the same." Grace studied his profile in the moonlight, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "You never told me your story, either." Yale was quiet so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I grew up in Texas. My father had a small spread outside of San Antonio. Nothing like this, just enough to get by. When I was 16, a man named Blackwell decided he wanted our water rights. My father refused to sell." Grace could hear the tension in his voice and remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "One night, Blackwell's men came. They beat my father badly in front of me and my mother. Said it was a warning." Yale's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. 2 days later, they came back. My father was still bedridden from the beating. They shot him. Then my mother, when she tried to stop them. "Oh, Yale," Grace breathed, horrified. "I'm so sorry." "I wasn't home," he continued, his voice flat. "I was out checking fence lines. When I returned, the house was burning. I couldn't even bury them properly." "What did you do?" Grace asked softly. "I tracked down every man who was there that night," Yale said, his eyes distant. "Took me 3 years, but I found them all. Made sure justice was served." The way he said it left no doubt in Grace's mind about what form that justice had taken. She should have been frightened, perhaps, to be sitting next to a man who had hunted down and killed others. Instead, she felt a deep sadness for the boy he had been, forced to grow up in the cruelest way imaginable. "After that, I drifted," Yale continued, his tone lighter now. "Worked as a ranch hand, rode with the Rangers for a spell, did some bounty hunting. Then I won Half Moon in a poker game 5 years ago." "You won this ranch in a card game?" Grace couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Yale's smile returned. "The previous owner was a gambling man with more land than sense. He bet the deed thinking I was bluffing. I wasn't." "That's quite a story," Grace said, shaking her head in wonder. "Not so different from yours in some ways," Yale observed. "We've both had to make our way alone in the world." Grace nodded, feeling a connection forming between them that went beyond employer and employee. They were two survivors who understood loss and resilience. "It's getting late," Yale said eventually, standing up. "You should get some rest. Jim will need tending in the morning." "Good night, Yale," Grace said, rising as well. He reached out suddenly, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was fleeting, but sent a jolt through Grace that she wasn't prepared for. "Good night, Grace," he said quietly, then turned and went inside, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart beating faster than it should have been. In the days that followed, Grace found herself watching Yale with new eyes. She noticed the way he treated his ranch hands with respect, how he never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself, the gentleness with which he handled injured animals. And she caught him watching her 2 quick glances when he thought she wouldn't notice, a lingering look across the dinner table. Jim recovered steadily under Grace's care, and word of her medical skills spread among the ranch hands. Soon they were coming to her with all manner of ailments and injuries, splinters, cuts, bruises, and once, a dislocated shoulder that she set with Yale's help. "You're becoming indispensable," Yale remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, a habit they had fallen into after dinner. "The men trust you." "I'm glad to be useful," Grace replied. "It makes the time pass more quickly." Yale's expression shifted. "Are you so eager to leave us then?" The question caught Grace off guard. I hadn't thought of it that way." And she hadn't. Somehow, in the 3 weeks she'd been at Half Moon, the ranch had begun to feel like home in a way nowhere had since her parents died. The work was hard but satisfying, the people kind, and the land itself had a wild beauty that spoke to something deep inside her. "You could stay, you know," Yale said, his voice casual but his eyes intent on her face. "After your 6 months, as a free employee with full wages." Grace felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Vance?" "I suppose I am, Miss Abernathy." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Half Moon could use someone with your talents permanently. And He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I've grown accustomed to our evening conversations." Before Grace could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Yale stood, instantly alert, hand moving to the pistol he wore even on the ranch. 3 men rode into the yard, their horses lathered with sweat. Grace recognized the lead rider immediately and felt the blood drain from her face. Vernon Tully. Yale stepped in front of Grace protectively. "Tully," he called, "you're a long way from Silver Creek." Tully dismounted, his round face flushed with exertion or drink, probably both. "Vance, I've come for what's mine." "There's nothing of yours here," Yale replied, his tone deceptively mild, but his stance rigid. "The girl," Tully spat. "Abernathy, the judge has reconsidered her case, says she needs to serve her time under my supervision, not out here where she's probably living in luxury." Grace moved to stand beside Yale. "The contract was sold to Mr. Vance fair and square," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You have no claim on me." Tully's eyes narrowed. "Still got that mouth on you, I see. We'll fix that soon enough." He turned back to Yale. "The law's on my side, Vance. I've got the papers to prove it." "What did you do, Tully?" Yale asked quietly. "Bribe the judge, threaten him, or just get him drunk enough to sign whatever you put in front of him?" "Doesn't matter," one of Tully's companions interjected. "Papers are papers, legal and binding." Yale's hand still rested near his gun. "I paid for Miss Abernathy's contract. I have the receipt and witnesses." "The judge says that contract is void," Tully insisted. "She's to come with us now, unless you want to be charged with kidnapping." Grace felt sick. After everything, to be handed back to this cruel, petty man who would make her pay dearly for every moment of freedom she'd experienced at Half Moon. "Let me see these papers," Yale demanded. Tully reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Yale took it and read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This is a forgery," he said finally. "I know Judge Wallace's signature. This isn't it." "Are you calling me a liar?" Tully blustered, his hand moving toward his own gun. "Yes," Yale said simply. "And a fool if you think I'll let you take Grace anywhere." The tension in the yard was palpable. Grace noticed Frank and several of the ranch hands had appeared, alerted by the commotion. They stood a short distance away, hands near their weapons, waiting for Yale's signal. "You're outnumbered, Tully," Yale pointed out, "and on my land. I suggest you leave while you still can." Tully's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Vance. That girl made a fool of me, and nobody does that without consequences." "She's under my protection now," Yale said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Any harm comes to her, I'll hold you personally responsible, and I promise you won't like how that ends." For a long moment, it seemed Tully might risk a fight anyway. Then, muttering a curse, he remounted his horse. "Watch your back, Vance, and keep that female leashed. Next time I see her in town, I won't be so forgiving." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode out, his companions following close behind. Grace realized she was trembling only when Yale placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she managed, though her voice shook. I thought it was over, that I was safe." Yale's expression was grim. "Tully's not the type to let go of a grudge, but he won't try anything tonight, not with his tail between his legs." Frank approached, rifle in hand. "Want me to have the boys take shifts watching the road, boss?" Yale nodded. "Double the night watch for the next week, and no one rides alone for a while." As the ranch hands dispersed to their duties, Yale guided Grace back to the porch. "I'm sorry about that," he said once they were seated. "I should have expected Tully might try something." "It's not your fault," Grace assured him. "Vernon Tully has been nursing his wounded pride for weeks. I'm just sorry I've brought trouble to your doorstep." Yale shook his head. "You haven't brought anything but good to Half Moon, Grace." His use of her first name, now becoming more frequent, sent a pleasant warmth through her, despite her lingering fear. "What will happen now?" she asked. "I'll ride to Tucson tomorrow, speak to the territorial marshal. Make sure he knows Tully's trying to circumvent the law." Yale's expression softened as he looked at her. "Don't worry, I won't let him take you." The conviction in his voice made Grace believe him. Still, that night she lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, replaying Tully's threats in her mind. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams were filled with pursuing riders and the sound of gunshots. She woke to find sunlight streaming through her small window and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Dressing quickly, she found Marta already at work, preparing breakfast. "Yale rode out at dawn," the older woman informed her. "Said to tell you he'll be back by nightfall." Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped to speak with him before he left. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Set the table," Marta instructed. "Then check on Jim. His stitches need looking at." The day passed slowly, each task only partially distracting Grace from her worry about Tully and what Yale might be facing in Tucson. By late afternoon, she had run out of things to occupy herself and found herself pacing the porch, watching the road for any sign of riders. Frank found her there as the sun was beginning to set. "He'll be back," the foreman assured her. "Yale can take care of himself." "I know," Grace said, though she wouldn't feel certain until she saw him ride through the gate. Frank's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, but Grace felt compelled to answer anyway. "He saved me. Of course I'm concerned." "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Frank said kindly. "I've known Yale Vance for 5 years. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know what you mean," Frank chuckled. "Sure you don't." He nodded toward the road. "There he is now." Relief washed through Grace as she spotted Yale riding toward the ranch, apparently unharmed. She hurried down the steps as he dismounted in the yard. "What happened?" she asked anxiously. "Did you see the marshal?" Yale handed his reins to a waiting ranch hand. "I did, and Judge Wallace too. He confirmed what I suspected. He never signed any papers transferring your contract to Tully. It was a forgery, just as I thought." "So Tully has no claim on me?" Grace asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple. "None whatsoever," Yale confirmed. "In fact, the marshals issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of document forgery and attempted fraud. Tully's going to have more pressing concerns than bothering you now." The relief was so overwhelming that Grace's knees nearly buckled. Yale must have noticed because his arm came around her waist, steadying her. "You're safe, Grace," he said softly. "I promised you would be, remember?" Looking up into his face, so close to hers now, Grace felt something shift between them. The concern in his eyes was mixed with something deeper, something that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, and his arm tightened slightly around her waist. Then, seeming to remember they were standing in the middle of the yard, with ranch hands nearby, he stepped back. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You look tired." Grace nodded, suddenly aware of the exhaustion weighing her down after a night of little sleep. "Good night, Yale." "Good night, Grace," he replied, watching as she turned and walked back to the house. That night, Grace slept deeply and dreamlessly. secure in the knowledge that Vernon Tully could no longer threaten her. When she woke, she felt renewed, ready to face the day and whatever it might bring. What she hadn't expected it to bring was a letter, delivered by a passing mail rider. Marta handed it to her at breakfast, the plain envelope addressed simply to Miss Grace Abernathy, Half Moon Ranch. Who would be writing to me? Grace wondered aloud, turning the envelope over in her hands. Only one way to find out, Marta replied pragmatically. Grace broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. "What is it?" Marta asked, alarmed by Grace's sudden pallor. "It's from Mrs. Potter, my former employer in Silver Creek," Grace explained, her voice faint. "She says my aunt has been trying to find me. Apparently, she's been searching for months." "Your aunt?" Marta repeated. "I thought you had no family." "I thought so too," Grace said, still staring at the letter. "My mother had an older sister who moved east before I was born. They lost touch. I never knew her." She looked up at Marta, bewildered. "According to this, she's wealthy, widowed, and looking to make me her heir." Marta's eyebrows shot up. "Her heir? To a fortune?" Grace nodded slowly. "Mrs. Potter says my aunt is staying at the Grand Hotel in Tucson, waiting for word of me." She folded the letter carefully. "I need to speak with Yale." She found him in the barn, discussing breeding stock with Frank. Both men looked up as she approached, and Yale immediately noted her troubled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. Wordlessly, Grace handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his face unreadable. "Your aunt," he said finally. "This changes things for you." "Yes," Grace agreed, uncertain why his neutral tone made her heart sink. "If it's true, I could have a family again, a future I never imagined." Yale handed the letter back to her. "You should go to Tucson, meet her, find out if this is real." "You think I should go?" Grace asked, searching his face for some sign of how he felt about the possibility of her leaving. "Of course," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "This is an opportunity you can't ignore. I'll have Frank drive you in the wagon tomorrow." Frank, sensing the tension between them, made a show of remembering an urgent task elsewhere and departed, leaving them alone in the barn. "My 6 months aren't up," Grace said quietly. "My contract—" "Consider it fulfilled," Yale interrupted. "You've more than earned your freedom, Grace. I won't hold you to a contract that should never have existed in the first place." His formality hurt more than Grace would have expected. After weeks of growing closer, of evening conversations and shared smiles, it felt like he was already distancing himself from her. "What if I don't want to go?" she asked boldly. Yale looked startled. "Why wouldn't you? This aunt can give you everything you've been missing: family, security, a place in society." "And what about what I've found here?" Grace pressed. "The work I've come to love, the people I've come to—" She stopped, afraid to say too much. For a moment, Yale's composure slipped, and she saw naked longing in his eyes, but he quickly masked it. "Half Moon will always be here, Grace. You can visit whenever you wish." "Visit," she repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Is that all you want from me, to be an occasional visitor?" "What I want doesn't matter," Yale said roughly. "What matters is what's best for you, and that's not being tied to a remote ranch and a man with a violent past." "Shouldn't I be the one to decide what's best for me?" Grace challenged, taking a step closer to him. Yale's hands clenched at his sides, as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "You deserve better than this life, Grace. Better than—" he swallowed hard. "Than me." Before Grace could respond, he turned and strode out of the barn, leaving her alone with the letter that had so unexpectedly complicated everything. The next morning, true to his word, Yale had Frank prepare the wagon for the journey to Tucson. Grace packed her few belongings mechanically, her heart heavy. She had hoped Yale might change his mind overnight, might ask her to stay, or at least admit that he wanted her to. But he remained distant, speaking to her only to confirm the arrangements for her trip. As she prepared to leave, the ranch hands gathered to say goodbye. Jim, now walking with just a slight limp, thanked her again for saving his leg. Marta pressed a package of food for the journey into her hands, along with a fierce hug, and whispered good wishes. Even Frank seemed genuinely sorry to see her go. Yale was the last to approach as she stood by the wagon. "I've written a letter of introduction for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "And there's something else." He passed her a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "Your wages, plus a bit more, to help you get established." Grace took the pouch reluctantly. "I don't need your money, Yale." "Take it anyway," he insisted. "Please." She slipped the pouch into her pocket, then looked up at him, memorizing the lines of his face, the blue of his eyes. "Thank you. For everything." Yale nodded, his expression guarded. "You should get going. It's a long ride to Tucson." Grace waited, hoping he might say something more, might give her some reason to stay or promise to come for her. When he remained silent, she turned and climbed into the wagon beside Frank. As they pulled away from the ranch, Grace looked back once. Yale stood where they had left him, a solitary figure watching them go. Then he turned and walked toward the house, shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of control rather than indifference. Grace faced forward, blinking back tears. Perhaps it was better this way. A clean break, a new beginning, even if it felt like leaving behind the only place she had ever truly belonged. The journey to Tucson took most of the day. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, casting the desert town in shades of gold and purple. The Grand Hotel was easy to spot, a 3-story building of red brick that stood out among the adobe structures surrounding it. "I'll wait," Frank offered as he helped Grace down from the wagon. In case this isn't what you're hoping for." Grace squeezed his weathered hand gratefully. "Thank you, Frank." Taking a deep breath, she straightened her simple dress and walked into the hotel lobby. A clerk directed her to a private parlor where, he informed her, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield was taking tea. The woman who rose to greet Grace was tall and elegantly dressed, with silver-streaked dark hair that immediately reminded Grace of her mother. There was a family resemblance in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her mouth that made Grace's heart contract painfully. "Grace?" the woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it really you?" "Aunt Eleanor?" Grace replied, suddenly uncertain. The woman stepped closer, studying Grace's face with obvious emotion. "You look so much like your mother, my dear sister Harriet." Something about her tone, the way she said her mother's name, convinced Grace more than any documentation could have. "It's really you," she whispered. "I thought I had no family left." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "When I finally tracked down your parents' last known address and learned they had died years ago, I feared the worst. But the postmaster in Kansas remembered you had gone west. I've been following your trail ever since." "Why?" Grace asked. "You never knew me." "Because family is precious," Eleanor replied simply. "And you are all I have left in this world." Over tea, Eleanor explained that she had married a wealthy Boston merchant who had recently passed away, leaving her his entire fortune. With no children of her own, she had decided to find her sister's family, never expecting to discover that Grace was alone in the world. "Come back to Boston with me," Eleanor urged, covering Grace's hand with her own. "I can give you the life you deserve, education, society, everything your mother would have wanted for you." Grace's mind whirled with possibilities. Boston. A life of comfort and culture, so far removed from the harsh realities of the frontier. A chance to know her mother's sister, to have family again. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I need time to consider it. This is overwhelming." Eleanor nodded understandingly. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. I'll be in Tucson for another 2 weeks before I must return east." When Grace emerged from the hotel, Frank was waiting patiently with the wagon. "Well?" he asked as he helped her up. "It's true," Grace said, still dazed by the encounter. "She's really my aunt. She wants me to go to Boston with her." Frank nodded thoughtfully as he guided the horses through the town streets. "And what do you want?" "Miss Grace?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Boston is so far away, so different from everything I know." "Different from Half Moon, you mean?" Frank observed shrewdly. Grace sighed. "Yes." "Yale's a proud man," Frank said after a while. "Too proud sometimes. Thinks he doesn't deserve happiness because of his past." "He made it clear he thinks I should go," Grace said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. Frank snorted. "What Yale says and what Yale wants aren't always the same thing." He glanced at her. "He cares for you. More than cares, I'd say. but he'll never stand in the way of what he believes is best for you. They stopped for the night at a small roadside inn, continuing their journey at first light. As they approached Half Moon the next day, Grace was struck by how right it felt to be returning. The sprawling ranch with its backdrop of mountains already looked like home in a way no other place ever had. Yale was working with a young horse in the corral when they arrived. He looked up at the sound of the wagon, surprise and something like hope flashing across his face before he schooled his expression into careful neutrality. Grace thanked Frank and made her way to the corral. Yale met her at the fence, his hands resting on the top rail. "You're back," he said, stating the obvious. "I am," Grace agreed. "Your aunt?" he asked. "Is real," Grace confirmed. "Eleanor Whitfield. She's my mother's sister and apparently very wealthy. She wants me to go to Boston with her." Yale's knuckles whitened on the fence rail, but his voice remained steady. "When do you leave?" "I haven't decided that I am," Grace said, watching his reaction carefully. Yale's eyes widened slightly. "Why wouldn't you? It's the opportunity of a lifetime." "Perhaps," Grace acknowledged, "but it would mean leaving behind something I've come to value very much." "Half Moon will still be here," Yale said, echoing his words from before. "You can always come back to visit." "It's not the ranch I'd be leaving behind, Yale," Grace said softly. "Or not just the ranch." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a vulnerability she'd never seen there before. "Grace, you told me once that what you want doesn't matter," she interrupted. "But it does to me. So, tell me honestly, Yale Vance. Do you want me to stay?" Yale's composure finally broke. "God help me, yes," he said hoarsely. "I want you to stay more than I've ever wanted anything. But I can't ask that of you. I won't be the reason you give up a better life." "A better life," Grace repeated, stepping closer to the fence that separated them. "That's what my aunt offered. Security, comfort, society. But in the weeks I've been here, I've found something more valuable than any of that." "What?" Yale asked, his voice barely audible. "Purpose, belonging, joy." Grace reached through the fence rails to touch his hand. "Love." The word hung between them, charged with possibility. Yale's fingers closed around hers. "You can have those things without being tied to a former gunman in the middle of nowhere." "I don't want those things without you," Grace said simply. "I love you, Yale Vance. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said, 'Laugh all you want now, Darlin.'" A smile ghosted across Yale's face at the memory. "I knew then that you were special, that I'd never met anyone like you before." He took a deep breath. "I love you too, Grace, enough to let you go if that's what's best for you." "It isn't," Grace assured him. "My place is here, with you." Yale opened the corral gate and stepped through it, standing before her without any barrier between them. "Are you sure? Boston is a world away from the hardships of ranch life." "I'm sure," Grace said firmly. "I'll visit my aunt, get to know her, but my home is Half Moon now." Yale raised a hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. "I never dared to hope you'd choose me," he murmured. "After everything, I didn't think I deserved that kind of happiness." "You deserve it more than anyone I know," Grace told him. "You saved me, Yale, not just from Tully, but from a life without love." Yale's other arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "You saved me too, Grace Abernathy. I was just existing before you came along. Now, I'm living again." When he finally kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. His lips were warm and sure against hers, his embrace both protective and reverent. Grace wound her arms around his neck, pouring all her love and certainty into the kiss. They were interrupted by the sound of applause. Breaking apart, they turned to see the ranch hands gathered a short distance away, grinning broadly. Marta stood with her hands on her hips, looking satisfied, while Frank gave them a knowing nod. "About time," someone called, prompting laughter from the others. Yale kept his arm around Grace's waist, a smile spreading across his face. "Seems we have an audience," he murmured. "Seems we have a family," Grace corrected, looking at the circle of friendly faces. Yale's expression grew serious again as he turned to face her fully. "I want to do this right, Grace. No more contracts or obligations. Just a man asking a woman to share his life." He took her hands in his. "Will you marry me? Not because I bought your freedom or because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose me as I choose you. Yes, Grace answered without hesitation. 1,000 times, yes. Their second kiss was met with even louder cheers and a few good-natured whistles. When they parted, Yale kept hold of her hand as they walked toward the house, toward their future. 6 months later, Half Moon Ranch was transformed. Lanterns hung from the trees, tables were set up in the yard, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Guests from neighboring ranches mingled with the hands, all gathered to celebrate the wedding of Yale Vance and Grace Abernathy. The ceremony itself had been simple but meaningful, performed by a traveling preacher under an arch of wildflowers that the ranch hands had surprised them with. Grace wore a dress of pale blue silk, a gift from her Aunt Eleanor, who sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Eleanor had accepted Grace's decision with unexpected grace, saying that all she truly wanted was her niece's happiness. She had stayed at Half Moon for a month before returning to Boston, and now divided her time between the East and periodic extended visits to Arizona. As the sun set on their wedding day, Yale found Grace standing on the porch, watching their guests dance to the fiddle music in the yard. "Happy, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't believe how much has changed in less than a year." "All because you laughed at Vernon Tully," Yale mused, a smile playing at his lips. "Remind me to send him a thank-you note." Grace chuckled. "I doubt he'd appreciate it. Last I heard, he was serving 6 months for forgery. The judge wasn't amused by his attempt to circumvent the law." "Well, I meant what I said that day," Yale said, turning her in his arms to face him. "Laugh all you want now, Darlin, and for the rest of our lives together." "I intend to," Grace promised, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the stars began to appear in the twilight sky. 5 years later, Half Moon Ranch had prospered beyond even Yale's ambitious plans. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, 3-year-old twins, Harriet and Henry, named for Grace's parents, and baby Eleanor, barely 6 months old. Grace sat on the front porch, baby Eleanor in her arms, watching Yale teaching the twins to ride their pony in the yard. The sound of their laughter floated on the warm summer air. Marta emerged from the house, a tray of lemonade in her hands. "Those children will be as good on horseback as their father before long," she observed with grandmotherly pride. "And as stubborn," Grace agreed fondly as Yale patiently demonstrated proper rein handling for the 10th time that day. Their life wasn't always easy. Droughts, harsh winters, and the occasional rustler or bandit still tested their resilience. But they faced each challenge together, their love only growing stronger through adversity. When Yale finished the riding lesson and joined Grace on the porch, his face was flushed with sun and happiness. He took the sleeping baby from her arms and settled into the chair beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "How different my life could have been," Grace replied honestly. "If I hadn't laughed at Vernon Tully that day, if you hadn't been in town to hear the auction." Yale reached over to take her hand. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Grace squeezed his fingers, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together. "You know," she said with a smile that still had the power to take his breath away, "I think you're right." In the golden light of the setting sun, surrounded by the family and life they had created together, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she truly belonged. Not in the drawing rooms of Boston or the safe predictability of Silver Creek, but here in the wild beauty of the Arizona territory, with a man who had taught her that even the darkest past could lead to the brightest future. As if reading her thoughts, Yale leaned over to kiss her softly. "I love you, Grace Vance," he murmured against her lips. "And I love you," she answered, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the evening sky. "Forever and always."